a new video today. Today we're going to talk about how the Bible was made, or how Bibles are made in general. We're going to talk about where we get the scripture from. Now, a lot of atheists and people who just don't know the truth are perpetuating this lie, this not truth, that the Bible has been translated from one language to another language to another language. So they have like an old Bible like that's Greek or Latin, and then the language is starting to dissipate. So they take the new language and take the Bible and translate it into that, and then another language comes by, and that's not how the Bible is translated. Now, some people are really obnoxious and say, oh, the Bible was made by a couple of old white men sitting in a room and deciding what God had to say. None of that is true. We're going to go into the truth with detail, but not too much detail, because I figured if I put too much detail into this, those who would watch my channel might not be interested. It might get boring, and also there's a lot of people who don't understand the full depth of these things. So I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, but yet give you some truth to the facts behind how Bibles are made. We have today in our possession 5,300 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, another 10,000 Latin Vulgates, and 9,300 other early versions, manuscripts, giving us more than 24,000 manuscripts, copies of portions of the New Testament in existence today. Though we do not have any originals, we might debate that here in a moment, but that's what most people say. With such wealth of documentation at our disposal with which to compare, we can delineate quite closely with what the originals contained. No other ancient writing of antiquity has as many manuscripts as the New Testament. For example, if you want to compare, what we have for what the Bible says compared to what like Plato says or Socrates or some of these very ancient writings, that you will know when I show you that we have much more than what they have for those ancient documents. I'm going to show two pictures on the screen comparing the number of documents of like the New Testament to these other ancient manuscripts. I'll put them on the screen now. All right, so now we're going to get into this. So basically what I'm telling you right now is we'll have the Bible from these ancient manuscripts. We're going to talk a little about these and how they put them together to make the Bible. All right. The earliest manuscripts are known as papyri, a material prepared in ancient Egypt with a pithy stem as a water plant used in sheets throughout ancient Mediterranean world for writing or painting on, and also for making rope, sandals, and boats. So these ancient manuscripts, the oldest ones, most of the oldest ones, were made from this papyrus. Oh, before I forget, a lot of what I'm sharing today, almost all of it, okay? Almost all of it, what I'm sharing today comes from many resources. So if you want to delve into this deeper, down in the description, I will list the resources of where I got all these facts from, these truths from, where you can find this information, delve into it deeper from those places. But there are many, many hundreds, if not thousands of locations where you can confirm this information. To date, 88 papyri have been categorized. These date from the 2nd to the 8th century, 41 of them from the 2nd to the 4th century. So these are very, very old manuscripts and documents. Now, you heard me say originals. So there are a couple terms that people use about, what did the Apostle Paul, or any of his letters kept? Or John or Matthew, all these apostles, do we have any of the originals? Now, most people and most scholars will say no. Now, there is a possibility that we have one. But what these documents are called, these originals are called the original autograph, or sometimes they're called monographs. In the writings of Peter of Alexandria, who died in AD 311, we find a reference to the autograph of the Gospel of John still existed. That was in the year 311. And he wrote, Now it was the preparation about the third hour, as the accurate books have it, that the autographed copy itself of the evangelist John, which is up to this day, has been by divine grace been preserved in the most holy church of Ephesus, and is there adored by the faithful. Now, I said we might have evidence that we still have maybe a possible original manuscript from, we're going to talk about the manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew. So we may have the original autograph or monograph of Matthew, at least part of it, okay? Now this is called the Magdalene Papyrus, and what's in it is only 2 verses, Matthew chapter 26, verse 23, and verse 31 is found in this very old papyrus. The London Times reported that the evidence of an early form of writing paper was potentially important breakthrough in biblical scholarship on the level with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. The Magdalene fragments have been at the Oxford College since 1901. Little work has been done on them since 1953, when they were last edited by biblical scholars. But early this year, Thiede, Thiede, I put it on the screen, visited Oxford and inspected the papyrus. He concluded 3 scraps of text of the Gospel of Matthew inscribed in Greek have been traditionally believed to have been written in the late 2nd century, but German papyrus expert Carsten Thiede has published a paper arguing that these fragments kept at Oxford's Magdalen College very likely represent an actual eyewitness account of the life of Jesus. The Magdalene fragment now appears to belong to a style of handwriting that was current in the 1st century AD and that slowly petered out during the mid-1st century. Even a hesitant approach to questions of dating would therefore seem to justify a date in the 1st century about 100 years earlier than previously thought. In other words, they're saying this was written, according to this professional, this scholar, this was written in the same time the apostles were living and doing these things. The Magdalene fragment from the Gospel of Matthew has been identified as coming from a document dated to the middle of the 1st century AD, during the very lives of the apostles. This fragment is written in Greek and could even be a fragment from the original monograph written by the Apostle Matthew himself. This amazing new discovery is powerful evidence, obvious that the writer, evidently the Apostle Matthew, was very familiar with the Greek language and was capable of writing intelligently in it. Now, some people would like to argue that the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew, not Greek. Most scholars now believe it was Greek. I do have a video on that if you want to learn about the New Testament, what language it was written on, and about the names of God, whether you should use the Greek or use the Hebrew, or if you can use language English or whatever language you're from. I discuss that in another video. You can find that video here. All right, where you can delve into it more deeply. Again, I'll link my videos down below. So there are thousands of manuscripts from which to determine the text of the New Testament. Out of these, over 85% of the text found in all manuscripts is identical. So again, the text of the New Testament is very well attested. However, this still leaves about 15% of the text in which there are variants between the manuscripts. When these variants are compared, it becomes apparent that the manuscripts divide into 2 families. The first is the majority text. It is so named since it is developed with the assumption that under God's providence, the best reading was preserved in the majority of the manuscripts. Most of these texts come from the Byzantine history. Now, what is the Byzantine? The Byzantine Empire, also referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire or the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, don't be afraid. The Eastern Orthodox Church today is very different from the original. Just like you'll hear me talk about the Vulgate, the very ancient ones, is very different than the Catholic Church today. So don't be concerned about those things. Things have been corrupted and changed over years concerning the church. The Textus Receptus is very similar to the majority text. This was the Greek text from the King James Version of 1911 was translated from. The other modern-day Greek text is called the critical text, since it was developed by textual critics. Critics, okay, we understand what that is. The principles underlying this text were first put forth by Westcott and Hort in the late 1800s. These principles included the idea that the text of the New Testament should be approached like any other ancient book. So what I want to say is there are people out there who are translating the Bible and they are critics of the text given. They don't believe in the strength and the power of God preserving His Word, that we have everything from God and these kinds of things. That's why they are critical, and they have critical manuscripts that reflect their views. Again, this represents only a small amount of the manuscripts found. As such, according to Westcott and Hort, manuscripts should be weighed, not counted. In other words, don't have a whole bunch, but you have to take what we have and weigh them for their worth and their value. One major consideration weighing a manuscript is its age. The earlier, the better. Given this principle, their Greek texts mainly reflected the Alexandrian text type. The Revised Version of 1881 was based on this kind of Greek text. The Textus Receptus agrees with the majority text 99% of the time in handling the variants, and the critical text agrees with the majority text 98% of the time. So there's only a 1 to 2% difference overall between these published Greek texts. Moreover, the majority of variants among manuscripts and between the above mentioned Greek texts are insignificant. Some variations exist in the spelling of Greek words, in word order, and in similar details. These ordinarily do not show up in the translation and do not affect the sense of the text in any way. Thus, when there are differences between manuscripts, more often than not, the correct reading is easily determined. Even when it's not, the variant is generally insignificant. However, there are some important variants, and for these, the evidence is often divided as to which the original reading. And often, the majority text follows one reading and the critical text another. And it is because of these that there is a heated debate among scholars as to whether the majority text or the critical text best reflects the original. Bible students are often told the manuscripts called Codices Sinaiticus and Venaticus, put them on the screen, are older and better than other manuscripts. The implication being that they must therefore be more accurate. But this conclusion is wrong. To be sure, they are better in appearance, but certainly not in their content. Remember that they were written on expensive vellum. Vellum is prepared animal skin or membrane, typically used as writing material, so sort of like leather. So these two manuscripts were written in this vellum. That's why they survive so long, because it's a material that can survive. It's not paper, it's animal skin or membrane. So they ought to be in good shape. They are older, but older than what? They are older than most Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. But they are not older than the earliest versions of the Bible. The Peshitta, the Italic, the Waldensian, the Old Latin Vulgate, versions which agree with the majority text. Okay, so yes, there are ancient Bibles, and they can be used to make new Bibles. But what I'm saying here, and what these scholars are saying, that these manuscripts, which are old, but there are Bibles that are older than these manuscripts, they reflect and agree with the majority text rather than these two particularly old manuscripts. Again, they might be one of the oldest, but we have some that are older, very few, and we have Bibles that are older, which disagree with these two texts, which the critical text primarily uses. The critical text is often called the minority text. There are ancient Greek texts which are referred to as the minority texts simply because they represent only 5% of the existing manuscripts. Another 5% are neutral texts, sometimes agreeing with the majority and other times with the minority. The minority texts are also known as the Alexandrian texts because they were produced in Alexandria in Egypt. Some facts about the minority text, or again, the critical text, whatever you want to call it. The minority text abounds with alterations, one single manuscript being amended several times by different scribes over a period of many years. The minority text omits approximately 200 verses from the scriptures. The minority text contradicts themselves in hundreds of places. The critical text, again, the same as the minority text, the critical text that most modern-day Bible versions are based on is developed mainly Alexandrian manuscripts, Egyptian manuscripts from where Egyptian philosophy and heresies come from. Another thing that many people are concerned about. Okay, these Bibles that are made from critical texts come from the Alexandrian thoughts and philosophies and heresies that come from Egypt. Many of the ancient old heresies that were in the church were found in that region. The Textus Receptus, also called the traditional received text, and the Byzantine text, or the majority text. And let's talk a little bit about their facts. These are based on the vast majority, 90% of the 5,000 Greek manuscripts in existence. That is why it is called the majority text. These don't have deletions, additions, amendments as found in the minority text. These agree with the earliest versions of the Bible, Peshitta, which is made in and found in AD 150, very, very old. The Old Latin Vulgate, AD 157. The Italic Bible, AD 157, and etc. These Bibles were produced some 200 years before the minority Egyptian codices, manuscripts, existed or were found. These are untainted with Egyptian philosophy and unbelief. Again, so we're talking about the Textus Receptus, the majority text, okay? These do have these strengths. They're not affected by Egyptian philosophy. They have a majority, thousands and thousands of identical speaking of what the New Testament should hold, and they don't have all these alterations. The difference between the majority text and the Textus Receptus is the Textus Receptus was developed by a handful of Greek manuscripts, about 20, that were available in the 1500s. Meanwhile, the majority text is developed from over 5,000 Greek manuscripts now available. In other words, after they wrote the King James Bible, they actually found more ancient manuscripts. All right, we talked about the New Testament. What about the Old Testament? The work of the Jewish scribes gives the Christians confidence in the integrity of the Old Testament. Jesus and his apostles rebuked the Jews for their corruptions in religious matters, but never did they criticize them or the leaders of corrupting the documents of the Old Testament. So Jesus and the apostles didn't have any issues with their current Bible, but they had, okay? Because Jesus came, at the time of after his birth, which is AD 0 or so, somewhere so about around that. Some people say AD 3, some say AD BC 3, but there were thousands of years before that the Old Testament was written in. So therefore, if Jesus and the apostles accepted their Bible at their time, then we should be able to accept the Old Testament as well. What would be the point for Christ or his disciples to quote from Moses and the prophets if their writings were corrupted? But in actual fact, they frequently quote them, and they do this confidently without ever insinuating textual corruption. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the late 1940s, most scholars were of the opinion that the Old Testament manuscripts did not reflect the autographs with any degree of accuracy. Remember, autographs represents, what the original was. So what did Moses write? Is it accurate to what they had afterwards? The latest manuscripts dated only from the 10th century onwards. But the Dead Sea Scrolls contain many books from the Old Testament dating before the time of Christ, and wonder of wonders, they were very much similar to the medieval Masoretic texts in their contents. The work of the Masoretes was intended to guard against errors, so that even one small point could afterwards be altered or destroyed. Now, Masoretes, these were these Jews who translated the Bible into written word so that it could be kept afterwards. So they were very detail and oriented, so they kept everything perfect so that it would always stay the same. The Jewish scribes were very careful in transcribing the Old Testament, so much so that their carefulness amounted virtually to superstition. The Masoretes used to add the words of every line and note the number in the margin so that no one could add or subtract to it. So they always knew how many words were in the line because they kept track of the words for every line of every verse in the Old Testament. All right, let's summarize what we have learned here today. The Textus Receptus is the work of scholars a few hundred years ago based on 10 to 20 different manuscripts. These manuscripts were not the oldest of the time, but were consistently similar and were comparable to older Bibles that were there earlier. We read about those, okay? The majority text is the work of about 5,000 manuscripts, most of which are in agreement. They also are in agreement with the very old Bibles, some of which have been found after the compiling of the Textus Receptus, which are much older than those used in the Textus Receptus. The minority text is based upon a few manuscripts, perhaps the main one being the Alexandrian text, which may be the oldest Bible manuscript. The Alexandrian text has many problems discussed earlier and elsewhere. The biggest problems are that there are very few manuscripts included, and the amount of disagreement they have not only with the majority text, but with each other. They also have found even older Bibles that disagree with them and align more with the majority text. Overall, the majority text and the critical text, or minority text, whatever you want to call it, are very similar. When it comes to differences and decisions to be made on textual variants, they differ only by 2 to 4%. So at least 96% of the time, there's no dispute on what text reading is correct. All right, so what is my position on this? Okay, I will use any Bible. Okay, yes, I do prefer majority text translations. Okay, and the one I use probably 70% of the time in my videos is the modern King James Version. I will give you a list shortly. I'm going to roll it on the screen of all the Bibles that are majority text or Textus Receptus, and I'll put them on the screen. So what about the critical text? What about the minority text? What do I think of them? I think they're okay. Now, I'm not going to get into the details now about the corruption, how it's getting worse, and where they get that from, and what it comes from. I might talk about that in the future. But for now, I think it's safe to use most minority text translations. That's most of the Bibles people know about, the NIV and so on and so forth. Now, I believe the NIV is probably the worst, but it's still acceptable, and I actually will use the NIV once in a while, okay? Now, there are a couple other critical text, minority text Bibles that I use more often. Kevin explained that he likes to use the ESV. It's called the English Standard Version. Now, I heard of it before he told me about it, but I've looked into it, and I do really like it, and I have used it in some of my more recent videos, okay? And another of the Bibles of this type of translation that I use once in a while is the Amplified Bible, okay? So I'm going to scroll on the screen. I'm not going to read it because there's too many of them, of these Bibles translations that do come from majority text and the Textus Receptus. And yes, it is true, the King James Bible is not the only Bible that comes from the Textus Receptus. I will list those Bibles on the screen. Now, by the way, this list is not the same that I list on my website, nor in previous videos. Some of those in the list I had listed before. I found out, yes, they use the majority text, but they also use some of the critical text. So I've removed those. I've also found new ones. So this list is, if it's correct, and I actually went to ChatGPT, I think that's the name of it, and that computer confirmed that these are majority text Bibles and Textus Receptus. Let's list them on the screen now. Okay, so if you did hear, I did say, for now, I have no problem with critical text Bibles. But the thing is, I do believe that they will continue to get worse if the Lord tarries. I would say probably in 100 years, 200 years, the difference between the majority text and the critical text will be bigger than 2 to 4% because they keep corruption due to their stance on the Bible and changing the gospel and these kinds of things. That's why I think in the future it is going to be dangerous. For now, I think it is safe. As I said, 2 to 4% difference, and the differences are usually minor and they're not worth really arguing about in most cases. However, are there bad translations? Are there bad Bibles? Yes, there are. There are some Bibles out there that are not even translations at all. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about those. They're man-made. People just write what they want and think God what they think God meant, and those kinds of things. I'm going to stay away from those. I advise you to stay away from those also. But there are two what people call translations that are highly horrible, highly and full of error. Now, there is a man I've talked about recently in some of my videos named Mike Winger. I've been following his channel, and he talks about two of these translations. One is called the Mirror Bible. I really don't know anything about it. He says it's literally the worst Bible translation I've ever seen. His video, that's what the title of that video is, and you can see that video here. Again, it's about the Mirror Bible, and that video is called literally the worst Bible translation ever. See that video by Mike Winger for more about the translation called the Mirror Bible. Now, he also talks about another translation called the Passion Translation. He has a whole playlist of videos about how horrible this video is. And I think the playlist is called Exposing the Passion Translation. And you can watch those videos here. Again, there's multiple videos in that playlist. If you want to learn about that horrible translation, the Passion Translation. Now, I do know a little bit about this. Supposedly this guy says that God spoke to him and gave him supernatural knowledge of what the Greek and Hebrew text means, greater and higher and more in-depth than any other scholar has. So basically, he thinks he has his own authority by having a direct link to God and what the words mean in those languages, and he translates the Bible from what he thinks God has told him what those words mean. So he still uses the Hebrew and the Greek, but he has new word meanings to those words. It's quite a mess. Again, if you're interested, see some of his videos in that playlist. Other bad translations, obviously I recommend staying away from the Book of Mormon. They have, extra books that are not part of the Bible, but they have the same Bible we do, but they've twisted the scriptures horribly. So stay away from the Mormon Bible. Same with the Jehovah's Witness Bible. Stay away from that translation. It's been twisted and corrupted. Okay? Now you might say, Steve, okay, so you told me all this, but what about those other books of the Bible out there, like the book of Enoch? And how do we know that all those books that are in the Bible are from God and we can trust them? I actually have a video on that, so I'm not going to re-teach all those things. You can see my video here, Enoch and the other lost books. And that's where I go into detail about how we decide what goes into the Bible, what is called the canon. The word canon describes and tells us which books go into the Bible, and in that video I discuss that in detail so we know and can trust the Bible. Again, look at that video if you want to know more about which books we should trust as being in the canon and in the Bible and which should not be. Trust the normal Protestant New Testament that we have today. All right, folks, once again, if you want to learn more about these things, I have many more places where I got these things, this information from in the description before, links and things like that, where I got a lot of this knowledge. And again, you can explore this with Google and find a lot of this information. This isn't just some fringe truth. These are actual facts, and you can find the truth below listed in detail if you want to know more. All right, folks, hopefully this video helps you to understand where Bibles come from, that God has, I believe, preserved his word for us to have, and it's there and available for us today. God bless. We'll see you soon, Lord willing, if we're not raptured, if I'm not censored. God bless, folks. Have a good day. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you wish to keep up to date with all the videos from gospel-kingdom.com, I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel by clicking on the gold cross sword in the pink area in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Thank you, have a good day, and God bless.